The sky over Pyongyang curdled into a bruised, sickly purple, as if the heavens themselves were reacting to the messenger who rode through the gates. He did not need to speak. The dust on his boots and the frantic pace of his horse told the story before he reached the palace courtyard. Yeolji Mundeok was dead. The news hit the capital like a physical blow, silencing the markets and stalling the work in the iron forges. For decades, his name had been the wall that kept the Tang Dynasty at bay. Now, that wall had crumbled. Citizens stopped in the streets, looking up at the unnatural light bleeding across the horizon, their faces drained of color. The guards on the ramparts tightened their grips on their spears, eyes scanning the southern horizon for the vanguard of an army. Every heartbeat in the city felt heavy, measured against the reality of a border left wide open. The strategic balance had shifted in a single afternoon. The capital was no longer a fortress of confidence. It was a target waiting for the first wave of fire. The air grew cold, smelling of ozone and impending iron. Yeon Gaesomun stood atop the highest rampart, his back to the city. Below him, the streets of Pyongyang were a chaotic web of movement as the news of the defeat rippled through the districts. He watched a group of merchants abandon their stalls, their movements frantic and uncoordinated. He did not turn to look at them. Instead, his right hand moved to the hilt of his blade, his thumb tracing the worn metal pattern of the guard. The steel was cold, grounding his focus as the wind whipped his hair across his face. He felt the vibration of the city beneath his boots, the rhythm of a kingdom losing its pulse. He knew the pro-Tang factions within the court were already whispering, preparing to trade the city's sovereignty for their own survival. His fingers tightened around the hilt until his knuckles turned white. He had spent years watching the rot spread from the throne room outward. Now, the death of the general had stripped away the last pretense of stability. He looked toward the southern horizon, where the sky remained dark, and calculated the distance the enemy vanguard would cover by dawn. He would not wait for the collapse. He would dismantle the court himself, piece by piece, before the first Tang soldier crossed the river. He drew the blade an inch from its scabbard, the sound of metal sliding against metal cutting through the ambient noise of the city, and then he pushed it back into place with a sharp, final click. The air beside Yeon Gaesomun suddenly buckled. It was not a shift in the wind, but a violent tear in the fabric of the atmosphere, as if the space itself had been struck by a hammer. He pivoted, his hand flying to his blade, but the motion stopped mid-air. A shimmering, translucent distortion hovered just inches from his shoulder. It pulsed with a rhythmic, low-frequency hum that vibrated through his teeth. Within the haze, a figure flickered in and out of existence, a man not of this era, his movements jerky and disjointed like a broken reflection in water. Yeon reached out, his fingers passing through the cold, static-charged light. The sensation was like plunging his hand into a mountain stream in midwinter. He realized with a jolt that this was no ghost. It was a consciousness, trapped and compressed, anchored to the very steel he carried at his side. The 5 blades of Odo Gwon were not merely weapons, they were vessels. The distortion stabilized for a heartbeat, and the eyes of the archaeologist locked onto his. Information flooded Yeon's mind, not words, but raw, geometric patterns of terrain, siege logistics, and the crushing weight of a future he had never imagined. The soul of the stranger was bound to the metal, leaving Yeon standing in the silence, forever changed. The visions burned into his consciousness like hot iron. Yeon Gaesomun staggered back, his boots scraping against the stone, as the sheer scale of the incoming threat manifested in his mind. It was not a border dispute, it was not a raid. A massive, coordinated force of 500,000 soldiers was already in motion, their iron-shod boots churning the earth of the Liaodong plains. He saw the maps not drawn on parchment, but projected in the air before him, showing the Tang Dynasty moving like a slow, relentless tide of steel. Emperor Taizong was not merely seeking tribute, he was seeking the total erasure of the kingdom. Yeon watched the phantom movements of supply lines. The archaeologist's knowledge revealed the math of the invasion, the speed of their march, the weight of their armor, and the inevitability of their arrival. The air grew heavy with a phantom scent of smoke and scorched earth. He realized then that the court's petty squabbles were a death sentence. He looked at his hands, steadying them against the rampart wall, and felt the cold reality of the race he had entered. The Tang were not coming to negotiate. Yeon Gaesomun turned away from the ramparts, his stride purposeful and heavy. The hesitation that had plagued the court for years vanished with his descent into the inner palace. He moved through the corridors, his hand never straying from the hilt of his blade. In the central courtyard, he found the Minister of Rites, a man whose correspondence with the Tang emissaries had been documented by the archaeologist's visions. The minister looked up, his expression shifting from arrogance to sudden, sharp terror as Yeon approached. There was no dialogue, no trial, and no delay. Yeon closed the distance in 3 long, silent steps. He drew his steel in a single, fluid arc that caught the fading light of the afternoon. The blade bit deep, and the minister collapsed, his lifeblood staining the stone tiles. The guards nearby froze, their hands hovering over their own weapons, but they did not move. Yeon wiped the steel clean with a piece of rough cloth and turned to face them. His eyes were cold, reflecting the absolute necessity of the violence he had unleashed. He issued a single sharp command that echoed off the stone walls, signaling his men to seal every exit. The purge had begun. The final path led to the throne room. Yeon Gaesomun pushed the heavy doors open, the wood groaning against the stone floor. Inside, King Yeongyu stood near the dais, his hand trembling as he reached for a ceremonial bell to summon his personal guard. The sound never rang. The guards stationed at the base of the dais did not move toward the king. Instead, they stepped back, their eyes fixed on the floor. The silence in the room was absolute, heavy with the weight of a dying era. The king looked from his guards to the man standing in the doorway, his face draining of color. Yeon walked forward, his boots echoing against the marble, each step a final nail in the coffin of the old regime. He stopped at the foot of the dais. There was no struggle. The king slumped, his authority evaporating as the reality of the coup took hold. Yeon did not look at the man he had just deposed. He looked past him, toward the map of the borders pinned to the wall. With the old guard silenced and the court purged of dissent, the transition was complete. Yeon Gaesomun ascended the steps, his hand resting on the arm of the throne. The era of the great Magiclightaiil had arrived, forged in the quiet collapse. The throne room became a nerve center for total war. Yeon Gaesomun spread the scrolls across the table, his fingers tracing the topography of the northern frontier. He dictated orders that dismantled the existing bureaucracy, replacing administrators with military commanders who answered only to him. Every grain of rice, every forge, and every able-bodied man was now a resource for the defense. He did not sleep. He spent his hours calculating supply lines and fortification points, his mind sharpened by the strange, flickering visions of the archaeologist. A messenger burst into the room, breathless and covered in the dust of a long ride. He dropped to one knee and held out a sealed cylinder. Yeon broke the wax and read the report in silence. The news was as grim as he had anticipated. 500,000 Tang soldiers under Emperor Taizong had reached the Liao River. The vanguard was already crossing, their numbers turning the water into a churning mass of iron and banners. Yeon did not flinch. He burned the report in the flame of a nearby torch. He turned to his generals, his voice steady and devoid of doubt. He outlined the strategy for a scorched earth retreat, forcing the invaders into a landscape that would bleed them dry. Far from the capital, deep within the shadows of the Taihang Mountains, the air grew thick with the sound of hammers against stone. Young Munchun stood atop the ramparts of Ansi Fortress, his eyes scanning the horizon where the Tang banners would soon appear. He was the son of a legend, and he knew the weight of the coming storm. He did not wait for orders from the capital. He walked the perimeter, pointing to gaps in the masonry and ordering the laborers to double the depth of the trenches. A section of the outer wall crumbled under the weight of new stone, forcing a halt to the work. Yang grabbed a shovel, throwing his own strength into the pile, clearing the debris until his hands bled. The workers followed his lead, their pace quickening as the reality of the threat took hold. He directed the placement of heavy timber beams to brace the gates, turning the fortress into a jagged, immovable anvil. Yang stood on the highest watchtower, watching the distant hills, waiting for the first wave of the enemy to shatter against his walls. The Liaodong frontier vanished under the weight of the Tang advance. 500,000 men moved with a singular terrifying rhythm, their columns stretching across the plains like a dark, shifting tide. They did not pause for resistance. When they encountered the border outposts, they did not negotiate. They crushed. The vanguard swept through the fields, trampling crops and burning granaries until the horizon glowed with the orange light of ruin. A small settlement in their path attempted to barricade its gates, but the Tang heavy cavalry tore through the wooden barriers in seconds, leaving nothing but splintered timber and silence behind. The speed of the destruction was absolute. Every defensive line, every watchtower, and every hidden cache of supplies was systematically dismantled or set ablaze. The Tang army ignored the minor skirmishes, their focus fixed entirely on the path toward Ansi. They moved with a cold, mechanical efficiency. The silence shattered. A single horn blast signaled the charge, and the ground erupted as thousands of Tang soldiers surged toward the walls. Arrows darkened the sky, whistling like a swarm of angry hornets before clattering against the stone. Young Manchun stood at the main gate, his hand gripped tight on the iron bolt as the first ladders slammed against the parapets. The defenders pushed back, heaving heavy logs to snap the wooden frames, sending attackers tumbling into the moat. But the Tang did not falter. They climbed over their own fallen, their numbers a relentless, grinding weight. The air filled with the thick, acrid stench of burning pitch. A section of the outer wall gave way under the impact of a heavy ram, forcing the defenders to retreat into the inner courtyard. The clash of steel became a constant, deafening roar. Yang moved through the chaos, his blade flashing in the dim light. The fortress walls shook with every impact. There was no room for strategy now, only the raw, brutal necessity of holding the line. The direct assault had failed to break the gates. Emperor Taizong watched from his command tent as the tide of his infantry receded, leaving the base of the fortress littered with broken ladders and discarded shields. He did not order another charge. Instead, he pointed toward the high ground. The strategy shifted. If the walls could not be breached, they would be buried. Thousands of laborers were pulled from the ranks, their weapons replaced by shovels and wicker baskets. The rhythmic thud of pickaxes against the hard-packed soil replaced the clash of steel. Hour by hour, the pile of earth grew, a man-made hill rising steadily toward the height of the battlements. The Tang soldiers hauled massive loads of dirt and stone, dumping them into a growing mound that crept closer to the fortress with every passing day. Dust choked the air, swirling in thick, gray clouds that obscured the sun. From the ramparts, the defenders watched the mountain rise, a silent, encroaching monster. By the third day, the summit of the earthen pile stood nearly level with the parapets. Taizong stood on the peak of his creation, looking down into the courtyard. Yeon Gaesomun stood in the command tent, his eyes fixed on the shifting, translucent light that flickered beside him. The knowledge was not his own. It was a cold, precise logic that mapped the flow of water and the density of soil. He traced the lines of the earthen mountain on the parchment, noting the way the Tang engineers had piled the fill over a hidden subterranean stream. The mountain was not solid. It was a massive, unstable weight resting on a bed of saturated clay. Young realized the flaw instantly. He grabbed a marker and slashed a line across the map, indicating the exact point where the pressure would reach its breaking point. He sent runners to Young Manchun with specific instructions: ignore the summit, strike the base. The defenders began to dig, not into the mountain, but into the ground beneath it. They worked in silence, carving tunnels into the soft earth. Yun watched the horizon, his hand steady on the hilt of his blade. The terrain was no longer a barrier, it was a weapon. The Tang vanguard surged forward, thousands of boots pounding the summit of the earthen mountain. They carried heavy siege engines, their metal frames clanking against the packed dirt. Above, the air was thick with the smell of sweat and anticipation. Below, in the dark, cramped tunnels carved into the foundation, the defenders worked with frantic precision. They removed the final wooden struts, replacing them with thin, dry branches that would snap under the slightest pressure. Every strike of their tools was muffled by the heavy thud of the army moving overhead. They were carving a void into the very heart of the mountain. Young Manchun moved through the tunnels, checking the progress, his hands signaling for absolute silence. The ground above vibrated with the rhythm of the enemy march, sending loose pebbles cascading down the tunnel walls. The defenders retreated. The Tang soldiers reached the edge of the summit, unaware that the ground beneath them had lost its grip on the earth. The trap was set. The first sign was a low, grinding sound that rose from the depths of the earthen mountain. It was not the wind. It was the sound of millions of tons of packed soil shifting against itself. On the summit, the Tang vanguard halted. A jagged fissure, wide enough to swallow a man's boot, ripped open across the center of the plateau. Dust puffed from the crack, followed by the smell of churned ancient earth. The soldiers scrambled back, their formation breaking as the ground beneath them tilted at a sickening angle. Another crack appeared, then another, spider-webbing outward with the speed of a whip crack. The mountain groaned, a deep, tectonic protest that shook the very foundations of Ansi Fortress. Thousands of Tang soldiers lost their footing, sliding toward the widening chasms. The massive earthen structure was no longer a platform, it was a collapsing tomb. Every timber strut within the base snapped. Then, the movement stopped. The mountain, moments ago a churning mass of debris, settled into a sudden, impossible stillness. Thousands of Tang soldiers remained where they stood, balanced precariously on the shifting, fractured surface. No one shouted, no one drew a blade. The air itself seemed to thicken, pressing down with the weight of 1,000 held breaths. A terrifying silence swallowed the valley. broken only by the faint, rhythmic ticking of falling pebbles hitting the fortress walls below. The soldiers looked down at their feet, seeing the ground pulse like a living thing, yet it refused to give way. It was a vacuum of action, a moment where time seemed to fold in on itself. The vanguard remained locked in a state of suspended dread, their eyes wide, searching for a path that no longer existed. They were prisoners of the very structure they had built to conquer. On the ramparts of Annecy, the defenders watched in equal silence, their hands gripping the stone, waiting for the final gravity to take hold. The wind died down. The banners hung limp against the poles. Even the distant drums of the Tang camp fell mute, as if the earth had demanded a pause before the final act of destruction. The mountain held the army in its grip, a tomb waiting for the lid to close. Miles from the crumbling base, Emperor Taizong stood upon a raised dais, his eyes fixed on the massive earthen mound. He watched the silence with a thin, satisfied smile, convinced the stillness was the final submission of Annecy Fortress. To his generals, the lack of movement was a sign that the vanguard had successfully secured the summit. He raised a hand, his fingers curling in a slow, deliberate motion that commanded the reserve lines to prepare for the final surge. He did not see the hairline fractures widening beneath the feet of his soldiers. He did not hear the internal groans of the shifting earth. His focus was entirely on the prize, the strategic dominance he believed was finally within his grasp. He leaned forward, his posture rigid with expectation, waiting for the signal to march his entire army across the bridge of dirt. Taizong turned to his advisors, a sharp command on his lips, ready to claim a victory that was already turning to dust. The silence shattered with the sound of grinding stone. The earthen mountain groaned, a deep, tectonic roar that vibrated through the very marrow of the valley. Dust erupted in thick, choking clouds, swallowing the vanguard as the structure buckled inward. In the heart of the swirling grit, Yang Manchun stepped onto the edge of the rampart. He did not look at the falling soldiers or the crumbling earth. His eyes, cold and focused, scanned the distant command dais through the haze. He moved with the economy of a predator. His hand reached over his shoulder, fingers finding the fletching of a single heavy arrow. He drew the string back, the wood of the bow groaning in protest as it bent into a lethal arc. The tension in his shoulders was absolute. He ignored the screams of the dying and the thunder of the collapse. The world narrowed down to the space between his eye, the tip of the arrow, and the distant golden-clad figure of the emperor. He held his breath, his heartbeat slowing to a rhythmic, steady pulse. The dust cleared just enough to reveal the target. Yang Manchun stood motionless, a statue of intent, as the fate of the entire empire condensed into the iron point of his shaft. He was no longer a defender of a fortress. He was the final, inevitable consequence of the war. The bowstring hummed, a high-pitched vibration that cut through the roar of the collapsing mountain. Yang Manchun felt the wood bite into his palm, the tension pulling at his muscles until his frame felt like a coiled spring. He did not blink. The dust swirled around him, thick with the scent of pulverized stone and iron, but his vision remained fixed on the distant dais. He adjusted his grip by a fraction of a millimeter, his thumb pressing against the knock to ensure absolute stability. Time seemed to drag, the seconds stretching into an eternity of potential energy. The emperor remained visible through a narrow gap in the debris, his expression shifting from arrogance to sudden, sharp confusion. Yang felt the strain in his shoulder blades reach its limit. He exhaled a single, controlled breath, his posture locking into place. He did not release the arrow with a jerk. He let the string slip from his fingers. The bow snapped forward. The arrow vanished into the swirling gray haze, a dark streak of intent carving a path through the chaos. The mountain did not just fall, it surrendered to gravity. The massive earthen ramp, built with thousands of tons of soil and timber, shuddered as the internal supports snapped. A sickening crack echoed across the battlefield, louder than any war drum. The ground beneath the Tang vanguard tilted violently. Soldiers scrambled, their boots finding no purchase on the sliding, pulverized slope. The entire structure folded inward, a cascading avalanche of dirt and splintered wood. Men were swept off their feet, tumbling into the churning maw of the earth. There was no time to scream, only the wet, heavy thud of bodies being buried alive. The vanguard, once a wall of iron and ambition, vanished beneath a relentless tide of brown dust and stone. The air grew thick, turning the battlefield into a suffocating gray void. The roar of the collapse deepened, a tectonic grinding that vibrated through the very foundation of Annecy Fortress. Then, the motion slowed. The mountain settled into a jagged, uneven mound, burying the vanguard deep within its core. A heavy, unnatural silence descended over the valley, broken only by the settling of loose rocks and the distant, panicked shouts of those who had escaped the slide. The anvil had held, and the earth itself had become the final, absolute executioner. The arrow sliced through the swirling dust, a singular, focused point of lethal intent. It bypassed the frantic movements of the Tang officers, who were still reeling from the collapse of their earthen mountain. The projectile hummed, cutting a clean line through the heavy, stagnant air. It passed through a brief, wind-swept gap in the smoke, revealing the Emperor standing on his command platform. He was frozen, his gaze fixed on the ruin of his vanguard, his hand raised to issue a command that would never be spoken. The arrow did not veer. It maintained its arc with terrifying mechanical accuracy. The distance between the archer and the throne closed in a heartbeat. The Emperor's guards turned, their eyes widening as they caught the glint of the fletching, but they were too slow to intercept the flight. The arrow struck with a wet, sharp impact, finding its mark deep within the Emperor's eye. The sound was distinct, a sudden snap that cut through the lingering echoes of the landslide. The Emperor's frame jerked backward, his arm dropping as the force of the strike threw him off balance. The entire Tang command line shuddered. The scream erupted from the Emperor's throat, a jagged, inhuman sound that tore through the stunned silence of the command platform. He clawed at his face, his fingers tangling in the shaft of the arrow that now anchored him to his own demise. Blood, dark and thick, surged over his knuckles, slicking his grip and staining his hands a deep, visceral red. He staggered, his boots slipping on the wooden planks of the dais as his equilibrium vanished. The world he had sought to conquer narrowed to a singular, pulsing point of agony. He reached out, his hand grasping blindly for the hilt of his blade, but his fingers only met empty air. His knees buckled, the weight of his ambition suddenly too heavy for his failing frame. He crashed to the floor, his head lolling back as the darkness he had inflicted upon others finally claimed his own vision. The pain was absolute, a searing fire that erased the tactical maps and the grand designs of his campaign. He writhed on the platform, his breath coming in wet, ragged gasps that bubbled with blood. His eyes, one still clear and wide with shock, stared up at the smoke-choked sky, seeing nothing but the end of his reign. The silence on the command platform lasted only a heartbeat before the panic set in. Generals stood frozen, their mouths agape, watching the Emperor writhe in his own blood. The signal flags that had directed the assault moments ago dropped to the mud, abandoned by their bearers. A senior commander lunged forward, shouting orders that no one heard, his voice cracking under the weight of sudden, crushing realization. He grabbed a nearby officer by the shoulder, demanding a counterattack, but the man only stared at the fallen Emperor, his sword slipping from his numb fingers. The chain of command, forged through years of rigid discipline, snapped like dry timber. Word of the Emperor's injury rippled outward, traveling through the ranks faster than any messenger. The disciplined lines of the Tang vanguard began to waver, the soldiers turning to look toward the dais for guidance that would never come. Every officer was now an island, disconnected from the grand strategy, left to face the reality of their own survival. The structured formation of the army dissolved into a fractured, aimless mass. The paralysis broke, replaced by a primal, singular urge to survive. Soldiers turned their backs on the walls of Ansi, abandoning their siege engines and supplies in a frantic scramble toward the rear. The retreat was not a withdrawal, it was a stampede. Men shoved past their comrades, boots kicking up clouds of dust and gore, their eyes wide with the terror of the hunted. The narrow gates of the Tang encampment became a death trap. Hundreds of soldiers converged on the exits at once, colliding with such force that the air filled with the sound of splintering wood and desperate, guttural cries. Those who fell were not helped up. They were trampled into the churned earth by the boots of their own kin. The weight of the mass pushed forward, crushing the weaker against the barricades. There was no formation, no rear guard, only a surging tide of bodies desperate to put distance between themselves and the fortress. The roar of the rout faded into a hollow, rhythmic thrumming of wind against the ramparts. Young Manchun lowered his bow, his shoulders slumping as the adrenaline drained away, leaving him staring at the sea of discarded iron and broken banners. Below, the field was a graveyard of ambition. Yeon Gaesomun stood at the edge of the wall, his gaze fixed on the horizon where the last of the Tang forces vanished into the dust. He did not cheer. He did not sheath his blade. He walked slowly along the perimeter, his boots crunching on spent arrow shafts and fractured wood. Every step revealed the scale of the cost, the scorched earth, the piles of abandoned supplies, and the bodies of those who had fought for a border that remained as fragile as before. He reached the gate, where the mud was churned into a thick, dark paste. He stopped, looking down at the wreckage of a siege engine that had once threatened to bring the walls down. The victory was absolute, yet the horizon remained clouded with the threat of what would follow. He gripped the stone of the parapet until his knuckles turned white, his eyes scanning the distance not for enemies, but for the inevitable cracks that would form in the peace he had just secured. The war was over, but the weight of the crown felt heavier than the weight of the siege. In the capital, the victory at Ansi brought no stability. Within the inner chambers of the palace, Yeon Gaesomun's sons paced the length of the stone floors, their shadows stretching long and jagged against the tapestries. Namsang stood by the window, his fingers drumming a rapid, uneven rhythm against the frame, while his brothers watched him with narrowed eyes. The conversation, initially centered on the defense of the borders, quickly devolved into a bitter dispute. Namsang slammed his palm onto the central table, causing the inkwells to rattle. He demanded control over the eastern garrisons, claiming the right of the eldest. His brothers stepped forward, their hands resting on the hilts of their sidearms, refusing to yield a single inch of territory. The air in the room grew thick with the scent of stale incense and rising heat. One brother reached for a parchment map, but Namsang caught his wrist. The two locked in a tense, physical struggle that ended with the paper tearing down the middle. This was the true collapse. They no longer looked toward the borders. They looked only at each other, their faces hardened by a greed that eclipsed the memory of the war. Namsang did not wait for dawn. He moved through the palace corridors with calculated silence, his boots barely making a sound on the cold stone. He carried a leather satchel tucked beneath his arm, weighted with the stolen tactical scrolls of the northern defenses. He bypassed the main gate, slipping through a narrow service postern that led directly into the dark woods beyond the city walls. A group of riders waited in the shadows, their horses restless, breath misting in the night air. Namsang approached them without hesitation. He reached into his satchel and pulled out the scrolls, handing them to a rider whose armor bore the unmistakable mark of the Tang. The exchange was swift and wordless. As the riders turned and galloped toward the border, Namsang watched them vanish into the gloom. He turned back toward the capital, but the structure of the city already seemed different, less a stronghold and more a hollow shell. The foundations of Goguryeo shuddered under the weight of the betrayal. Walls that had withstood the might of an emperor now began to crack from within. The news of the defection hit the court like a physical blow. In the main hall, ministers stood frozen, their hands hovering over their blades, eyes darting toward the empty seats of the High Council. One official shouted an accusation, pointing a trembling finger at a rival who had supported the eldest son. The response was immediate. A chair crashed against the stone floor, splintering under the force of a kick. Steel rang out as guards drew their weapons, not to defend the palace but to secure their own survival. The orderly rows of the court dissolved into a chaotic scramble. Men who had spent decades serving the same crown now shoved each other against the pillars. A heavy tapestry was ripped from the wall, exposing the damp stone behind it as a group of soldiers surged forward to seize the treasury keys. The air filled with the sound of shouting and the rhythmic thud of boots on marble. There was no longer a central authority to command them. Yeon Gaesomun stood atop the highest rampart, his back turned to the burning city. Below, the palace courtyard was a sea of clashing steel and splintering wood. He watched as a group of soldiers forced the armory doors, their banners bearing the crest of his own bloodline. He did not shout. He did not call for his guards. He simply watched as the men he had raised to protect the realm systematically dismantled the gates. His fingers tightened around the hilt of his blade until the leather grip groaned under the pressure. He saw his younger sons leading the charge, their blades stained with the blood of the palace sentries. The realization hit him with the weight of a falling mountain. The Tang had failed to break these walls, yet his own children had succeeded in a single afternoon. He withdrew his sword, the steel ringing sharply in the cold air, and turned away from the ramparts. Yeon Gaesomun descended the stone stairs, his boots echoing against the walls of the inner keep. He moved past the abandoned guard posts, ignoring the distant screams rising from the lower districts. He reached his private chamber, a room carved directly into the mountain rock, and pushed the heavy oak door shut. The silence inside was absolute, a stark contrast to the violence outside. He walked to the center of the room and struck a heavy bronze gong. The sound vibrated through the floorboards, a deep, mournful toll that cut through the night air. He waited, his hand resting on the table. Minutes passed before the heavy latch lifted. The door creaked open, revealing two figures standing in the shadows of the corridor. Dae-jung-sang and Yi-jin stepped inside, their armor battered and stained with soot. They saw the gravity in his posture and the way he held his sword. He gestured for them to approach the table. Yeon Gaesomun looked at them, his eyes searching their faces for resolve. Yeon Gaesomun unrolled a series of vellum scrolls across the scarred oak table. The ink was fresh, detailing the rugged coastlines of the Shandong Peninsula and hidden mountain passes that bypassed the current front lines. He smoothed the edges with callous fingers, his movements steady despite the tremors in his hands. Dae Young-sung leaned in, his eyes tracing the ink lines, but he hesitated, his gaze shifting to the sounds of the palace gates splintering in the distance. Yeon did not let him look away. He gripped Dae Young-sung's forearm, forcing his attention back to the parchment. "This is not about the kingdom we are losing," Yeon rasped, his voice cutting through the ambient roar. "This is the blueprint for the one that must rise from our ashes." He shoved the scrolls into Dae Young-sung's hands, the paper crinkling under the pressure of the grip. He turned to Yi-jin, pressing a heavy, wax-sealed cylinder into his palm. It contained the strategic vision of a future state, a concept of power that transcended the current borders of Goguryeo. The two men stood frozen, the weight of the documents feeling heavier than the steel they carried. Yeon stepped back, his posture straightening as he watched them process the magnitude of the charge. Yeon Gaesomun turned his back on the pair, signaling them to leave. The heavy door clicked shut, leaving him alone in the center of the chamber. He knelt on the cold stone floor, reaching into the hidden floorboards beneath the table. One by one, he pulled out the 5 blades of Odogwan. They were cold, biting into his palms as he laid them in a circle around him. The air in the room grew thin, charged with a static hum. He placed his hands flat on the stone, closing his eyes to focus his remaining strength. The blades began to vibrate, a low metallic ringing. Yeon winced as he felt his own pulse begin to synchronize with the rhythm of the steel. He bit his lip, tasting iron, and forced his life force outward. The energy flowed from his chest, down his arms, and into the metal, turning the dull steel into a shimmering, translucent silver. He did not falter. He gripped the hilt of the lead blade, his knuckles white, and pulled the circle inward. The ritual had begun. His breathing slowed to a ragged, deliberate pace, each inhale pulling more strength from his body to feed the hungry metal. The chamber groaned under the pressure of the 5 blades. They were no longer mere steel, they were magnets of raw, discordant energy, pulling against each other with enough force to crack the stone floor. Yeon Gaesomun's hands hovered inches above the metal, his skin blistering from the heat. Suddenly, the air shifted. A faint, shimmering distortion flickered in the center of the circle, the trapped spirit of the archaeologist. It reached out, not with fingers, but with a pulse of pure, calculated logic that cut through the chaotic resonance. The blades stopped their frantic rattling, caught in a sudden, icy stillness. Yeon gasped, his vision blurring as he poured his final reserves into the void. The spirit guided the fusion, aligning the molecular structures of the 5 ancient steels. A low hum rose to a piercing shriek. Then, the blades turned liquid. They flowed toward the center, merging into a single molten mass of silver. The light erupted, blinding and absolute, scouring the shadows from the corners of the room. The 5 distinct edges vanished, replaced by the singular, terrifying weight of a divine blade. Yeon collapsed, his strength spent, as the light reached its zenith. The blinding radiance collapsed inward, leaving a single perfect blade hovering in the center of the room. It was not merely steel, it was a condensed point of absolute authority, humming with a frequency that made the very air ripple like water. Yeon Gaesomun reached out, his fingers trembling, but the blade pulsed with a sudden, violent kinetic force. It did not want a master, it demanded a destination. The metal began to glow with a deep, rhythmic violet light, and the space around the hilt fractured. A jagged tear appeared in the air, a dark void that smelled of ozone and ancient ice. The sword lunged toward the rift, dragging the ambient light of the room into its wake. Yeon watched, his breath hitching, as the weapon crossed the threshold. The rift snapped shut with the sound of a thunderclap, leaving the chamber in total darkness. The weight of the world lifted from Yeon's shoulders. He slumped against the stone, his heartbeat slowing, finally finding the stillness he had chased for a lifetime. The silence that followed was absolute. Far from the crumbling walls of the old empire, the sky over the northern plains split open. A streak of violet fire tore through the clouds, descending with the roar of a falling star. The snow-covered ground trembled as the light plummeted, cutting a searing path through the frozen air. Damduk stood on the ridge, his eyes fixed on the descending brilliance. The air grew sharp, smelling of ozone and ancient metal. He did not retreat. He held his ground as the object struck the earth just paces away. The impact sent a spray of ice and pulverized rock into the air, creating a crater that glowed with a fading rhythmic pulse. As the dust settled, the divine sword stood upright, embedded deep into the permafrost. It hummed, a low vibration that traveled through the soles of his boots and up into his chest. Damdeok stepped forward, the crunch of snow beneath his feet. He reached out, his hand hovering over the hilt. The long war of the past had ended, but the weight of the future had just arrived. Damdeok tightened his grip on the hilt, the cold metal bit into his palm, but the heat radiating from the core was intense, defying the sub-zero air of the plains. As his fingers locked around the handle, the blade flared once, casting long dancing shadows across the snow. A sudden rush of images flooded his mind, the crumbling ramparts of a distant fortress, the sound of thousands of boots marching on stone, and the face of a man standing alone against an empire. The vision lasted only a heartbeat, yet it left the taste of iron and smoke on his tongue. The sword pulsed, its rhythmic humming synchronizing with his own steady heartbeat. He pulled. The blade slid from the permafrost with a sound like grinding stone, releasing a final brilliant flash of violet light that illuminated the entire horizon. The sky returned to its natural, star-dusted black. He held the weapon steady, its weight balanced perfectly in his hand. The echoes of the ancient war faded into the wind, replaced by the sharp, crisp silence of the northern winter. He turned away from the crater, his path forward suddenly clear. The wind picked up, swirling snow around his boots as he left the crater behind. The blade in his hand shifted, its violet hue dimming into a steady, golden luminescence that cut through the gloom of the tundra. Each step he took felt heavier, not with burden, but with the accumulated weight of 1,000 years of history. He looked toward the mountains, the peaks jagged against the rising moon. The sword hummed a different tune now. He did not look back at the place where the sky had torn open. The past was a closed book. He reached the edge of the ridge and paused, watching the vast expanse of the northern plains stretch out before him. He tightened his hold, the metal warming against his skin until it felt like a part of his own pulse. With a final, decisive movement, he stepped forward into the unknown. The legend of the old empire had ended. The horizon swallowed his silhouette as he descended into the valley. The golden glow of the blade cast long, flickering patterns against the ice-slicked rocks. A sudden, violent gust of wind whipped across the plains, bringing a wall of white that obscured the path ahead. He did not falter. He drove the tip of the blade into the frozen earth, using it as a pivot to steady his stance against the gale. The sword pulsed in response, emitting a low, rhythmic heat that melted the ice around his boots. The storm howled, but the space immediately around him remained clear, an island of calm in the chaos of the winter night. He pulled the blade free and continued, his stride rhythmic and purposeful. The echoes of the ancient war were gone, replaced by the crunch of snow underfoot and the steady resonant hum of the steel. He reached the tree line, where the shadows deepened. He turned once, looking back at the vast, empty expanse, then faced the path ahead. He stepped into the trees, the golden light fading into the dark. The forest floor was a tapestry of frozen needles and ancient roots. He moved through the dense timber, the rhythmic strike of his boots the only sound in the stillness. Ahead, the canopy broke, revealing a ridge that overlooked the entire valley. He climbed the slope, his breathing steady, his focus fixed on the horizon, where the first hint of dawn began to bleed into the sky. The sword remained silent now, its light fully absorbed into the steel, becoming a weightless extension of his own resolve. He reached the summit and stood motionless, watching the light spread across the plains. The history of the fallen kingdoms, the wars, and the shifting borders were now distant echoes, buried beneath the snow. He felt the cold air against his skin, a sharp reminder of the world he was tasked to shape. He turned away from the ridge and descended toward the valley floor, his path clear and unburdened. The cycle of the old era had reached its natural conclusion. He walked until the trees hid him from view, leaving no trace of his passage on the frozen ground. The silence returned to the plains, absolute and expectant. The legend was no longer a memory trapped in time, but a foundation for the world that was yet to be built. The sun crested the jagged peaks, casting long, sharp shadows across the valley floor. The frost on the ground began to retreat, turning into mist that clung to the low-lying brush. Where the traveler had stood, only the wind remained, swirling the loose snow into transient, nameless shapes. The silence of the plains was absolute, undisturbed by the echoes of the past or the movements of the present. High above, a hawk circled, its cry thin and sharp against the vast, pale expanse of the sky. The valley floor was empty, the path he had taken already reclaimed by the shifting drifts. The light intensified, washing over the frozen earth until the horizon blurred into a single, seamless line. The story, like the footprints in the snow, had been erased by the wind, leaving the plains to the stillness of the coming spring. The earth held its breath. Beneath the surface, the deep rhythmic pulse that had defined the landscape for centuries finally slowed to a halt. A faint vibration traveled through the frozen crust, causing the ice crystals to shift and settle into a permanent alignment. The light that had been caught in the atmosphere dispersed, fading into the natural clarity of the morning. There was no longer any tension in the air, no lingering static of the rift that had brought the blade to this place. The wind died down, leaving the snowdrifts undisturbed. The valley floor was now a static canvas, stripped of the chaotic energy that had once defined it. A single bird took flight from a nearby ridge, its wings cutting through the stillness as it crossed the expanse. Below, the ground remained firm, the history of the blade now fully integrated into the soil. The cycle had not just ended, it had been absorbed into the foundation of the world. The horizon stretched out, vast and unburdened by the weight of the past. Everything that had been brought across the threshold of time was now part of the earth itself. The silence was no longer expectant, but complete. The frost began to yield. A thin layer of water pooled in the depressions of the rock, reflecting the pale, widening sky. The heavy silence that had gripped the plains for so long started to fray at the edges, replaced by the subtle, rhythmic drip of melting ice. Nature reclaimed the space, indifferent to the steel that lay buried deep beneath the permafrost. The shadows shortened, and the harsh, biting cold softened. There was no trace of the rift, no lingering distortion in the air. The land had returned to its original unshaped state, ready to host the footsteps of those who would walk it next. A small stream carved a new path through the silt, washing away the last remnants of the storm. The horizon remained clear, a vast, open expanse. The cycle had fully dissolved, leaving only the earth, the sky, and the slow, inevitable progression of the seasons. Life would return to these plains. The wind carried the scent of damp soil and coming growth, sweeping across the empty ground. The story had reached its final, quiet conclusion, leaving the world to turn, unburdened and free, into the light of a new day. The sun climbed higher, casting long, sharp shadows across the undulating terrain. Where once there was the clash of steel and the weight of empires, there was now only the steady movement of the wind through the tall, dormant grass. The ground had hardened, sealing the secrets of the past deep beneath layers of silt and stone. No markers remained to indicate the significance of the soil. The land had effectively erased the evidence of the struggle. A hawk circled high above, its cry piercing the vast, empty sky, echoing over the plains without finding a reply. The temperature rose, and the last patches of snow vanished into the earth, leaving the surface clean and unbroken. Time continued its relentless forward march, indifferent to the names of kings or the fates of nations. The silence was absolute, a testament to the passage of an era that had left no trace but the quiet, enduring presence of the plains. The light shifted, turning from the harsh glare of midday to the soft golden hues of late afternoon. The plains stretched out in every direction, a vast canvas waiting for the first mark of a new age. There was no movement, save for the rhythmic swaying of the grass in the cooling breeze. The silence was no longer heavy. It was expectant. A single cloud drifted across the sun, casting a fleeting shadow that swept over the ground like a phantom. The world felt scrubbed clean, stripped of the heavy burdens of ambition and war. Everything was now merely the dust beneath the surface. The horizon remained a sharp, clean line, separating the earth from the infinite possibilities of the sky. No echoes remained. The cycle had not just ended, it had reset, clearing the path for the next chapter to unfold. The wind died down, the world turned, and the light began to fade into the quiet, peaceful dark of the coming night. The sky suddenly fractured. A jagged violet tear ripped through the twilight, shedding light that did not belong to this world. From the center of the rift, a streak of white-hot intensity plummeted toward the frozen northern plains. The air screamed as the object tore through the atmosphere, leaving a trail of ozone and shattered shadows. Below, the snow-covered expanse remained motionless until the impact. With a thunderous crack that shook the permafrost, the divine sword struck the earth. It drove deep into the ice, vibrating with a low, resonant hum that silenced the wind. A young boy, Damdeok, stood 10 paces away, his breath hitching in the sudden cold. He blinked, the reflection of the glowing blade dancing in his eyes. The sword stood upright, a pillar of ancient metal pulsing with a faint, rhythmic light. The rift above closed as quickly as it had opened, leaving only the biting silence of the winter night. Damdeok took a hesitant step forward, his boots crunching on the crust of the snow. He reached out, his fingers hovering inches from the hilt, feeling the hum of 1,000 years of history vibrating against his skin. The legend had not ended, it had simply found a new hand. The metal felt alive under his palm, warm despite the biting frost of the plains. Damdeok pulled, and the sword slid from the ice with a sound like a long-held breath finally released. As the blade cleared the ground, the rhythmic pulsing light flowed into his arm, tracing the veins of his wrist like liquid fire. He did not tremble. The weight of the steel was immense, yet it felt balanced, as if it had been forged for his grip alone. He looked toward the northern horizon, where the first stars were beginning to pierce the deepening blue of the twilight. The echoes of the past, the sieges, the strategies, the fallen empires faded into a singular, clear purpose. He planted his feet firmly, the snow crunching beneath his weight. He took one step, then another, moving away from the crater and toward the vast, uncharted expanse of his own future. The sword hummed a final, low note that resonated through the frozen earth. He was the first light of a new era. The wind picked up, whipping snow against his face, but Damdeok did not slow. The sword in his hand pulsed in time with his stride, casting a faint, steady glow that cut through the swirling white. He reached the edge of a frozen river, the ice thick and jagged, blocking his path. He did not hesitate. He stepped onto the surface, the blade's hum vibrating through the ice, revealing the safest path across. With every movement, the weight of the steel felt less like a burden and more like an extension of his own resolve. He reached the far bank and climbed the ridge, his breath coming in sharp, rhythmic clouds. At the summit, he stopped. The horizon ahead began to bleed with the first pale light of morning, turning the gray sky into a canvas of gold and violet. He began his descent, the first true king of a new age, walking directly into the light. He descended the ridge, his boots finding purchase on the frost-hardened earth. Below, the skeletal remains of an ancient watchtower rose from the snow, its stones cracked by centuries of neglect. Damdeok approached the ruin, the sword in his hand humming a low, resonant frequency that seemed to wake the ground. He stopped at the center of the structure, where the wind died down to a whisper. He knelt, pressing his palm against the frozen soil, feeling the deep, dormant pulse of the land. With a steady motion, he drove the blade into the center of the tower floor. The steel sank deep, anchoring itself into the bedrock. A ripple of light surged from the point of impact, racing outward to touch the horizon, clearing the mist from the valley. The sky stabilized, the clouds parting. He stood, his hands empty, yet his grip still felt the phantom weight of the legacy. The silence was the quiet of a kingdom waiting for its first command. He turned away from the ruin and walked toward the rising sun, leaving the blade as a silent sentinel. The era of shadows had ended. The age of the new king had begun.